introduce Bill Hyder, tonight's speaker, who will be telling us about lingering wisps of blue smoke, Santa Cruz cigar tokens. So light up a cigar and have a listen.
All right, let me go and get this shared and play from the start. So what I've been doing during the pandemic is when I was no longer able to travel to go to shows, I had a travel budget that I put into acquiring Ron Lurch's collection of Santa Cruz tokens and Santa Barbara tokens, both things that I had been collecting, but with acquiring his collection, I greatly expanded my holdings to the point to where I could start writing about them. And so I've been working through those collections and writing about individual businesses or writing about collections of things as I do the research. And this particular talk tonight on cigar tokens is not all the cigar dealers that issued tokens, but most of them, and they all had a common thread of that they were all interacting in one way with either politics or one dealer that started a manufacturing that I'll get to in a few moments. But cigars, Mark Twain, it is often said, swore that if I cannot smoke cigars in heaven, I shall not go. And maybe he said it, maybe he didn't, nobody knows for sure. But they did document that on his 70th birthday, he did say, "It has always been my rule never to smoke when asleep and never to refrain when awake." And that brought my mind to cigar store tokens and really what they meant. And in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where a lot of people collect saloon tokens. That was hangout of men. But cigar stores were also hangouts of men. And it was working men, or I say men who labor with their hands and backs, shopkeepers, businessmen, writers, journalists, and politicians. They all enjoyed a good cigar throughout American history. And from the very beginning in Santa Cruz, there were cigar dealers, but I'm starting this story in 1881 when Aaron Cohen and A. Fibish briefly partnered in establishing a cigar manufacturing business in Santa Cruz. Their relationship lasted less than 6 months, but Cohen continued in the business and became a leader in the local cigar business for over the next 40 years. And this is a picture of the upper end of Pacific Avenue in 1881. The Pacific Ocean House, which is very famous, is here. Aaron Cohen's shop was just across the street. And as I came to discover, Cohen had his fingers in selling cigars in lots of different places. So his name shows up throughout this story, and that's why I started with him. What is interesting is Cohen and Fibish, their ad in 1881, manufacturers of and wholesale and retail dealers in cigars. Pacific Avenue, opposite the Pacific Ocean House, only white labor employed. Now, immediately your mind is going to go to the end of the Civil War and white labor, but white labor is not what you think it is. White labor says they did not employ the Chinese because the Chinese were the low end of the totem pole. The picture here on this next screen, this is the Pacific Ocean House right here. Pacific Avenue, Front Street, just out of the picture, right on the left-hand side was Chinatown. And Chinatown was basically shanties, houses, disreputable houses, brothels, and one or two saloons. But all of the saloons, cigar dealers are clustered in this upper end of Pacific Avenue. This was the center of Santa Cruz and life in Santa Cruz in the late 1800s. In 1892, Jack Mano and his friend Joe DeMichele moved from Santa Jose to Santa Cruz with the intention of hiring around 10 to 12 men to manufacture cigars if they were well received in the city. And the emphasis is on manufacturing cigars because there weren't, cellophane wrappers weren't invented and became common until the 1910s, about 1920. So if you wanted a fresh cigar, it had to be made in town. Not everybody made cigars in town, so there were cigars that came in from elsewhere and were sold, but the most prominent dealers were those who made their own cigars. And there's two tokens here. The top token, good for one cigar, is 24.5 millimeters. So this is not a slot machine, a nickel in the slot machine token. This would be a trade stimulator. This particular token is made by Klinkner in San Francisco. The bottom token at 21 millimeters, this was probably a slot machine token. The fact that it's denominated good for 5 cents in trade, it probably dates to 1902 or a little earlier. And what started happening in 1902 is that the courts were giving clues that tokens denominated in monetary values would be a symbol of gambling. And they weren't outlawed yet, but people started changing their tokens to be good for a product. And from the style of this reverse, this is probably a Patrick and Company token. Mano and DeMichele were very important. Oops, I hit the wrong button there. Their token, Jack and Joe Santa Cruz, good for one cigar. This probably dates to 1905. It's the only one I've ever seen. So right now it's rare until I find another one. They became one of the primary manufacturers, in addition to Cohen, of cigars in Santa Cruz. And this one from the Santa Cruz Sentinel from 1908, they had 15 employees, counting themselves. They worked year round. The owners are at the workbench when not waiting on customers. They employ 8 men, 3 girls, and 2 boys. The tobacco is received from Cuba in 130-pound bales. Duty is 35 cents a pound. The wrappers are from Havana. 2 grades are used. The 25-cent Jack and Joe cigars use the better wrapper. It costs $6 a pound, of which $1.65 is duty. And the lower grade Sumatran wrappers for the 10-cent cigars is $3.60, of which $1.60 is duty. And Jack and Joe, they became known as the Jack and Joe Club because men would gather in their meeting room to smoke cigars, and they made decisions about who was running for the city council and mayor. And it was said that you didn't want to miss one of those meetings, otherwise you might be up for running for mayor. And one of the mayors that was a 3-time mayor, a dentist by the name of Dullard, he had cigars made for him by Mano and DeMichele, and they were known as Dullard Specials, and he distributed them to all of his friends. So cigars were an important part of male social life. The next dealer in here is Fred S. Cox. He was a native-born Santa Cruzan. He made his living representing San Francisco cigar manufacturers as a traveling salesman, and he had a regular route between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And I'm assuming on one of those trips he met M.L. Smith. M.L. Smith relocated from Santa Barbara, actually Betaravia, where he ran a business for a national company. And he relocated to Santa Barbara, leased a storefront on Pacific Avenue in March 1909, and Smith and Cox went into partnership and opened a cigar store on Pacific Avenue. And in this postcard, which probably dates to 1911, here you can see the Smith and Cox cigar sign. It's electrified, and I know from newspaper articles that they received permission to put up an electric sign in 1910, and so that pretty well dates this particular card. Across the street is the St. George Hotel. Just out of the picture, the direction the women are walking was Pacific Ocean House. That was kind of run down and no longer the premier place in town. It was the St. George Hotel on the other side of the street, and that was remodeled frequently. And if you see here, there's Smith and Cox cigar, the ad, there's this note here that there are club rooms in connection. And so the club rooms, a place where men would gather to smoke cigars, was an important part of the business. This 21 millimeter token was likely used in slot machines. Smith and Cox, 44 Pacific Avenue. It's struck by Moisa in San Francisco. There's one other token from a hotel in Santa Cruz that has the same reverse. So, you know, there was clearly a salesman that was promoting the product. And like I say, this was probably used in slot machines. The other two tokens, the good for 12.5 cents and good for 5 cents in trade, they're both Moisa tokens. These are larger, would not have been used in slot machines. So most likely they were used as change, because a fresh cigar was important. And if you had a deal of 2 cigars for a quarter, you could take a cigar and a token and then get your other cigar at a later date, ensuring that it was fresh. And same thing for 5 cents in terms of change for cigars. This Smith and Cox good for 12.5 cents in trade is probably one of the most common tokens that you encounter from Santa Cruz. At least it's readily available. Another dealer, Frank McCarrier, he began his tenure as an employee of Mano and Dimicelli in 1906, after working in local cigar stores around the country since 1890. The December 29th, 1914 Santa Cruz Evening News ran a notice that McCarrier was striking out on his own and would open his own manufacturing business on the second floor Howe building for sale to the trade. And his primary cigar was the La Cruz. Cigars burn at the old price, his McCarrier's cigar factory and cigar stand. And his 21 millimeter token was probably used in slot machines. And I find it interesting as California was going through the battles over slot machines, both temperance and slot machines were being opposed by churches and the temperance movement and so forth. And in 1907, slot machines were ruled illegal unless they were only done with paying out like good for a cigar or good for gum, instead of being good for a nickel or some kind of denomination. And if you read the newspapers, read through the old newspapers in Santa Cruz, you discover that slot machines are around until about the 1940s, when the police finally cracked down on them and began confiscating them. And in 1907, which would have been just before the McCarrier tokens would have come out, one of the ministers, a Baptist minister in Santa Cruz, was complaining that even though slot machines were illegal, the police ignored them. And basically they ignored them because even the politicians and city councilmen, everybody played the slot machines. And so the police did not intervene unless there was a problem. And in 1907, there was a list of businesses that agreed to remove their cash paying slot machines from their businesses in order to avoid a city ordinance making them illegal. And when you read through the list of those who signed the petition, you had the saloons, as you would assume, the cigar stores, as you would assume, drug stores, tourist businesses. So there were a lot of different businesses that were running slot machines up until the 1930s and until the 1940s, when they finally began cracking down on them. McCarrier became very successful, and he indicated, the newspapers indicate that he bought the cigar business at the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. And at the boardwalk, when the Neptune Casino opened in 1904, and this is a picture of the casino in 1904, there was a cigar stand in the casino, and I'm assuming that this casino cigar store, Santa Cruz, California, good for one cigar, because of the fancy nature of the one, that this token dates to 1904, 1905, when there was a cigar stand in the Neptune casino. And clearly it was good for a 5-cent cigar. That's why the .05 is on the token. Again, this one is struck by Patrick and Company. The person who opened the cigar stand went out of business in 1905. And Aaron Cohen, who I started this story with, he bought the business in 1905, and he owned it when the Neptune Casino burned to the ground in 1906. And when it reopened again in 1907, Cohen still had the cigar stand in there. The one thing that Cohen never did, as far as I can tell, is that he never issued a token. If he did, he didn't do it under his name, and I've not been able to find any that I can actually link to him. But McCarrier then bought that business from Cohen and opened a couple of other cigar stands on the beach to catch the trade. As well as independent cigar dealers, most saloons had cigar stands within the saloons, either their own cigars or they had a cigar stand just inside. And a good example of this is the Commercial Saloon at 124 Pacific Avenue. The commercial predates 1890s, but in 1893, Walsh and Beck, that's the upper commercial token there, they bought the cigar stand operated by Aaron Cohen, just inside the front of their saloon at the end of August 1893. And at some point, likely after Beck sold his interest in the saloon, they sold the stand to O.H. Niehaus, who later sold the stand to Fred Stevens. And so this unlisted commercial token by just J. Walsh as opposed to Walsh and Beck probably dates to the time that that Fred Stevens bought the commercial cigar stand from Walsh and was operating it inside the saloon. And this is an L.H. Moisa token, the commercial, the Walsh, and the commercial cigar stand is an L.H. Moisa. So he bought that in 1898. He sold the stand in 1901 and went to work for Cohen. Once again, Cohen running through the story. That lasted about 3 months and he bought the stand back. And then he sold it again in August 1904. And the new owner, Jim Wood, issued this token, good for one cigar. And I have to thank Ed Erickson for this photograph. This is the only one that I've ever seen, but it is not in my collection. The token says it's for the smokehouse. His ad at the time lets you know that it is the commercial cigar store, so he used both names. And this is obviously a Doug token. I've been looking for one myself, and I have yet to find one. Another saloon had a little less savory reputation to it, and that was the old Corner Saloon, owned by Mitchell Krilanovich. He bought the saloon, the old Corner Saloon, in February 1899. And so that makes his saloon token interesting because it's and when I hit the wrong thing on my computer, it advances or whatever. It's a Klinkner token. By 1899, Moisa had bought the Klinker company and was using the old dies. So this was obviously a die that was in use from prior to Moisa purchasing the business. Krilanovich doubled the interior space. He added the counter where hot lunches were served, but he continually ran afoul of the law. And finally, in 1907, an underage boy testified that Krilanovich served him alcohol in the saloon. In court, Krilanovich denied the charge, but the jury obviously did not believe him. They did believe the boy, and they were debating whether or not to remove his license. And the judge said the liquor license belonged to the city, not to the business order. So the mayor removed his license in November of 1907. And shortly thereafter, rather than lose his business altogether, Krilanovich converted his old Corner Saloon into the old Corner Cigar Stand in early 1908. And again, his new token, also by Moisa, good for 5 cents in trade. So this is in 1908. It's after the saloons and so forth, Kralanovich among them, had agreed to remove their slot machines, their nickel in the slot machines that paid out money. Well, he's got a slot machine token good for 5 cents in trade. So despite his promise, you know that they still had slot machines in the cigar store. He eventually went out of business. He had more problems with the law, etc. And the business was demolished in 1910. He showed up on the day they were going to tear down the building. And he was there because on the floor beneath the counter, when they ripped the counter out, it was covered in coins, mostly nickels, but there were a few other denominations and a $5 gold piece. And he claimed all of that as his and recouped that money. So you've got to picture this old style building. It's a cigar store. There's probably a slot machine or two on the counter, and slipping down through all the cracks in the wood and so forth are nickels that are accumulating on the floor beneath the stands. So they were obviously very popular machines and activities. The most interesting in terms of the fact that they are the most prolific is the Ben Wise and Wise and Ronnie. Wise opened his saloon in September 1907 at 284 Pacific Avenue. He ran his saloon until Prohibition, when he converted it to a public pool and billiard hall. Now, Wise opened his saloon in 1907. He was one of the petitioners who promised to remove their slot machines that paid out money if the city didn't pass an ordinance outlawing slot machines that were good for goods like cigars or gum or what have you. And in November 1907, there was an article right after he opened that his saloon was broken into and somebody broke open his 50-cent slot machine and took all the money in it. So we know that he had an active slot machine running in his saloon in 1907, shortly after he opened. But it was a 50-cent machine, not a nickel machine. And these are a few of his tokens. The 21 millimeter Ben Wise, that's obviously a slot machine token. The good for 5 cents is probably a slot machine token, but it could have been used for giving change as well. And then these larger good for 1 drink or good for a 10-cent drink were obviously trade stimulators or exchange. If maybe somebody bought you a drink, you weren't ready, you could get a token and claim it later. Those are all the Wise tokens. When he converted after Prohibition, he converted his saloon to a billiard parlor and a soft drink stand. And in April 1920, his brother-in-law, John Ronnie, quit his position with the city water department to join Wise in buying the cigar and candy business that was located in the front of the saloon. And they continued to issue tokens for that business. Interestingly, these are all 21 millimeter tokens. So some of them may have been used for change, but it's in the 1920s, so change wouldn't have been that hard to come by. There's obviously slot machines that are still being used in this business, maybe paying out gum, maybe paying out a cigar, and maybe if nobody was looking, you could exchange the tokens for cash. But here's another set of their tokens, 2 more 5-cent, and then a 10-cent token that probably dates to when they first opened in 1920. As soon as Prohibition was ended, the soft drink emporium became a beer hall. And so they went back to the alcohol business as soon as they could. They sold the business in 1936, and Wise passed away in 1940. With the exception of the 10-cent tokens, the 21 millimeter brass tokens are very common. So they produced a lot of tokens for their business, implying that they had a lot of business throughout the years in their store. I have to thank Michael Weiner for the photograph for this next one, the Cabin Cigar Store. In 1929, so they're still using tokens. This is a 20 millimeter token, likely not a slot machine token. They were in a commercial building at 15 Soquel Avenue, just off of State Street, off of Pacific Avenue, and right adjacent to the downtown business district. I don't know when it first opened. 1929 is the earliest reference I can find. But in 1932, they remodeled their business to achieve a log cabin appearance inside and out. They had electrical fixtures inside in the shape of oil burning lamps. And the paper said that helped create a homey comfort seldom found in a business of this type. But gambling was probably still going on. The Volnay Club, located in the rear of the cigar store, was cited for bookmaking on the Kentucky Derby in 1934. And then Frank Nash bought out Stone's share of the business in 1935. And they hired and employed L.B. Shorty Wilson. Shorty, he was a baseball player, now retired. He pled guilty in 1936 to operating a horse race betting scheme out of the cigar store. In 1936, the end of 1936, that's when the Santa Cruz Police Department finally started cracking down on gambling activities in the city. And from that point on through the mid 1940s, there are stories of them raiding a business, taking the slot machines, in some cases destroying them, in other cases having to hold on to them because the owners went to court and said that was their property and the police couldn't confiscate it. So these things were going on quite frequently in the cigar stores, particularly after Prohibition. When the saloons went away, the cigar store was kind of the last place where men could go to hang out. And what's interesting in reading those early newspaper reports is right after Prohibition, you see cigar stores start putting in radio lines. Well, why do they put in radio lines? Well, that allowed them to get the results of baseball games, of horse races, of various kinds of things that people might bet on. So having that line to get the results is not an illegal activity. Making book on those activities is, but that's something you could do without it being obviously to a novice eyes. But the police caught on, and they finally started building the cases against them. So this stuff is occurring around the heart of the city at the upper end, north end of Pacific Avenue. But in the right after 1900, Soquel Avenue moved out to the east, out to where farms and orchards were. It continued on to Soquel itself, and finally to Watsonville, which was another larger area. And houses started moving people started moving across the river. A bridge was put in on Soquel Avenue, and they moved across the river, and neighborhoods were building up there. And so businesses began to accumulate along the end of Soquel Avenue, just outside of the downtown business district. And the first one that I can find good data on is the Buckeye Emporium. The Buckeye was an interesting token. It's not a particularly rare token. It's not real common, but it's ready available if you went out to look for one. It is a maverick. It was listed in the catalog, so I bought it to add it to my collection. And after doing the research, I finally identified the Buckeye Emporium. It was opened by William Byler, soft drinks, cigars, tobacco, and candy. So this is a male retreat in this sort of new residential area. And Byler owned a number of businesses within a block on both sides of the street. He also had a mechanic shop for the new automobiles were around. He had a gas station. And so I don't know that he paid that much attention to all of his businesses, because the only reference to the Buckeye itself is that when he opened it and when he leased it. All of the other references in the paper are to his other business activities. And so whether he leased the space or sold the space, I'm not sure, but it ended up being run by an A.J. Frost. Frost admitted to selling a box of cigars out of the Buckeye to two young boys aged 12 and 7. And on October 12, 1926, he was arrested again for possession of illegal whiskey in his pool hall. Shortly after that, he sold the business to Theodore Wetmore, and Wetmore sold the business, which was now known as the East Side Cigar Store, to Walter L. Woodward in 1934. I believe the 21 millimeter East Side Cigar Store 5-cent token was probably to the earlier time in 1928. And again, it was used in a nickel slot machine is my best guess. And it's consistent with the kind of lackadaisical attitude the police had to gambling in the city. Woodward, when he bought it in end of 1934, he added a liquor license in 1936, as soon as Prohibition was over. And I'm assuming the East Side Cigar Store, good for 5 cents, 24 millimeter token, probably dates to Woodward's ownership of the cigar store. It's completely different in style from the earlier one. Now, Woodward, because the place was building up, Woodward had his liquor license pulled because it was in close proximity to the East Side Methodist Church. And when they started allowing liquor licenses again, you couldn't have a liquor business close to a church. And Woodward successfully went to court, demonstrated the existence of the business district and his business building and area as dating back to 1903, before the church. And the courts ruled that he could keep his liquor license because the church moved adjacent to the business as opposed to the business opening adjacent to the church. And I'm going to end with one that I picked up quite early. It's another maverick, Joe Bernheim, good for 5 cents in trade. And Bernheim was a very big name in Santa Cruz. They had a large mercantile store. They were around for years. And I assumed that this token came from Bernheim's when I bought it. So I was comfortable with it being a Santa Cruz token and fitting in with the name. Well, it turns out it wasn't for the Bernheim business. Joe Bernheim was born in Santa Cruz. It was his father who moved to Santa Cruz, opened a mercantile business. It became very successful. But Bernheim was the youngest son, and all of his brothers went into the business as he did after he got out of high school. And about 1898, 1899, after the Hotel St. George opened as a new high-end hotel in Santa Cruz, and a J.J. Leonard became manager of the hotel. Joe knew Leonard, really liked him, and so he went to work in the Hotel St. George instead of for his father, because he wanted to do his own thing. And Joe very quickly became popular. He was noted in some newspaper articles as being the most popular front desk clerk in the state of California. And they said he had an affable nature, and he was a great hunter and fisherman. He was written up almost every year for the record salmon and steelhead trout he caught in the streams at the mouth of San Lorenzo River in Santa Cruz. Every year during salmon season, he would go up to Humboldt County and fish in the Klamath River and caught record after record salmon. It was said that guests at the Hotel St. George would come to him and ask for advice about where they could go fishing when this fishing season opened. And they said that Joe, rather than telling them, would take a break, take them out fishing, and at the end of the day, everybody would return with smiles on their faces and their limit for the day of fishing. Same thing, deer hunting, what have you. He was very well known and very popular. In these days, traveling salesmen were a big deal. They moved around the country selling their goods. Some of them were representing Moisa and Patrick and the other token manufacturers. And the group in 1906 of traveling salesmen formed the Ambassadors Club. These are people that all stayed at the Hotel St. George. They knew one another, and they got together once a year at the Hotel St. George to drink and have a barbecue and all of that. And Joe Bernheim was an honorary member from the very beginning because he was so well liked and helped them everything. So he also was known for tending the garden at his family's house, and every day he would bring in a bouquet of flowers for the front desk at the Hotel St. George. And in 1920, he bought the cigar stand in the Hotel St. George, and this token obviously dates to his cigar stand in 1920. He was there until September 1939, if I got the date right, except for a 3-month interlude when the Hotel St. George got a new manager. And so he moved his cigar stand out of this Hotel St. George across the street into the Veterans Hall. And 3 months later, when the hotel manager was fired and a new one was hired, he moved his stand back in, and it was there until he retired. Like I say, I think it was September of 1939. He didn't have a long retirement. In December, on Christmas Eve, he had a heart attack and died. But this sort of nondescript token ended up having the most interesting story behind it, in the story of Joe Bernheim. And that's a quick tour through a set of cigar dealers. Because there were no tokens issued, what I didn't cover in here is that Smith and Cox, Smith sold his share of the business to Cohen, and so it became Cox and Cohen. And Smith did that to run for mayor. He did not win, but within the next 4 months, Smith and Cohen bought out themselves another cigar store that Cohen had started and sold Mano and Demicelli, because Mano died and Demicelli moved to San Francisco to go to work for another business. And so they ended up buying 4 of the largest cigar dealers and turning them into one cigar store. So Cohen ran through all of this thing. But these stories all take place right in this little area of Santa Cruz and right in this area on Soquel Avenue. And the boardwalk is right down here. So that was the only cigar stand that I really covered that was just out of that district. And I have to thank Michael Weiner and Ed Erickson for photographs. And this research is mostly done via newspapers.com. So that's a quick tour through the cigar stands in Santa Cruz.
Great, thanks, Bill.
There, it's back to you.
Yeah. Anybody have any questions for Bill?
This is Michael. I have one. Bill, Bill, you showed a lot of tokens, 5-cent slot machine tokens that were well after Prohibition.
Yes.
And yeah, that's interesting because I've in my research I've always focused before Prohibition, and I think maybe I'm missing things. And so I guess how many saloons turned into cigar stores?
Only a few. Most of the cigar stores are already there. There are many more cigar stores than there are tokens, and there are a few tokens that I am pretty sure were cigar stores that I did not include because I can't find the information to actually tie them down that they were in fact cigar stores. And they're not part of this set of stores that in one way or other, either the people worked for Cohen, they bought the store from Cohen, they got their start with Cohen, that sort of thing. So I had to constrain it to a set that I could, that was manageable for an amount of time. The early on, it's hard to tell whether a nickel token is necessarily used in a slot machine, although it probably is, because small change was in short supply. The San Francisco Mint wasn't making pennies and nickels and small change. And so that in a little town like Santa Cruz, that was hard to come by. Although Joe Bernheim, I didn't mention it, Joe Bernheim's dad did own a Moffett $20 gold piece that he liked to show off around Santa Cruz in the late 1800s, and was even written up in the newspaper because it was so unusual. And I was afraid that I'd put too much emphasis on the nickel and the slot machines, because like 1902 is when the first um, judicial rulings are coming down about slot machines. And in 1905, that's when in the state they said if it's good for merchandise, it's legal. If it's good for money, it's not legal. And like I said, in 1907, they're trying to outlaw slot machines in Santa Cruz, even though they're technically not legal. But then I kept coming, like Ben Wise. His 50-cent slot machine was broken into in the middle of the night and all the money was stolen out of him. I'm going, well, clearly he had a slot machine. I'm not familiar with 50-cent slot machines at that time, but it's in the newspaper, so everybody's aware of it, and certainly the police are aware of it. And as I follow these the articles through, it's not till that 1936 to 1940 time period that you finally start seeing articles that the police are confiscating and destroying slot machines in Santa Cruz. So they're there. And everybody knows that they're there, but they're just ignoring them. And I think they're ignoring them because all of the businessmen are part of the customers and they're playing them.
Well, I think it's worse than that, though, because we know that when Gunst was Moses Gunst was police commissioner, the cops would raid all the slot machines that weren't Gunst ones.
Right.
And so, you know, there was a certain amount of graft going on as well.
And I have an LA rubber stamp sales catalog. It's not dated, but there's a picture of a 1936 medal from Vernon, California in it. So it's got to be 1936 or just after. And on their token page, they list slot machine tokens. And certainly there's slot machines in Nevada, but I'm sure that a lot of their business is going on in California. And you know, whether they were the gum machines or what have you, you know, they tried to get away with it you could put a nickel in the machine and you could win a nickel, 10 cents, 15 cents, 25 cents, but half of the payouts were blank. And so that made it a gambling device. So they put in a piece of gum that cost a quarter of a cent for the non-winning things. So that technically, although many cities, and Santa Cruz was among them at the time, had ordinances outlawing them, but they also collect fees for them. And that's how I can find out what businesses had slot machines, that sometimes they'll list fees collected from a business that you go, well, why do they have a slot machine? It's
If they paid the fee.
Yeah, because they made money. So I think there's a lot more. My uneasiness turned to, well, this is really interesting, and there's more to this story as I started finding these other articles about when they finally started cracking down on machines. And somebody like Cohen, there are no slot machine tokens that have a name of Cohen or any business that I can associate with him. So I'm assuming that either he was leasing the machines, or a lot of these mavericks that that are around that were probably just used as generic tokens, that you could buy a box of tokens with a D on it. And although some places use different letters in different machines so they could use it in their accounting, but either Cohen was actually just had nickel machines, because I know in 1898 he was protesting a tax on his slot machines because he didn't think it was fair that he should pay a tax on what was inside his business when he already paid a tax on the business. And so there would be no reason for him to dispute the tax if he didn't have slot machines.
Okay. Any other questions for Bill?
I have one. You mentioned Jack and Joe cigars that they brought in leaf tobacco from Cuba. That was before the Panama Canal. So do you know how the tobacco actually got into California? That's quite a journey.
All the tobacco came in through San Francisco, and McCarrier, there's a longer article about McCarrier when he was opening his cigar store. And he said, you can make, by the time you add the transportation, it's so little. Buying tobacco on the dock in San Francisco and taking it to Santa Cruz was no more expensive than having the cigars made in San Francisco and transporting them. And when you think about the numbers of cigar stores and even the number of saloons before Prohibition, when Mano and Demicelli opened their cigar manufacturing business in 1892, Santa Cruz had a population of 4,000. So you got to figure less than half of that are adult males. And by 1920, Santa Cruz is around 14,000 people. But you also have, starting in the 1904, when the casino opened at the Beach Boardwalk, that's when you get the big hotels and you've got a lot of tourists. So they're selling to the tourist trade as well as to local people. But there's no television. It's before cars. What did you do if you were a man? You went to the saloon or you went to the cigar store. And McCarrier, in the article that I wrote for TAMS that'll come out next year, it's a little longer. McCarrier was also, his place was a hangout for politicians as well as Mano and Demicelli, because another mayor, when he got married, he passed out McCarrier cigars at his wedding. And this newspaper said, and it's not just any cigar, this is fine McCarrier needles that everybody wants. So these were social clubs as well as hangouts and that kind of stuff.
Okay. Any last questions for Bill? Alrighty then, let's go on to some sharing, some memory